Hello, everyone. So, in our session today, we are talking about PTSD, specifically in Army veterans. To talk about this topic, we have Dr. Ramdan. He is an Army veteran who is also a naturopathic doctor as well as an acupuncturist. Welcome, Dr. Ramdan.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for having me on this podcast today.
All right. So, let's just understand what exactly is PTSD relative to, in relation to the Army veterans.
Okay. So basically, PTSD, it's where you get exposed to some degree of trauma or some stressful event, and then it has that negative reaction on sort of like your mental health. So you end up with varying types of symptoms, such as like hypervigilance, anger, irritability, avoidance. So you try to avoid certain situations that are potentially triggers. The hyper awareness comes from just being exposed to such traumatic that you're always on track. And with PTSD, it's basically your body gets stuck in fight or flight, and it's as a result of our natural survival mechanism. So we are designed to survive regardless of what happens, and our body puts us into fight or flight in order for us to survive. When you get to the point of PTSD, we are unable to turn that switch off. So we go into fight or flight because of the necessity to survive, and then we're unable to switch that off. So when you go into fight or flight, everything in your body sort of focuses on what is most important for survival. So one of the reaction is blood would be pumped to your leg because it's like you have to run or react. It's less that is going towards digestion. It's less that is going towards different other aspects of your body. So everything is to make you survive in that instance. So whatever the incident is, wherever you're exposed to that traumatic event, especially like if you're overseas on a deployment, and you're exposed to any type of bombs or shooting or anything like that, what happens is within your mind that you get stuck in that mind frame. So that snapshot of when that actual event happens, you become stuck there, and that gets replayed over and over. So regardless of how much you change situation, once you're stuck in fight or flight and something triggers it, be it a smell, be it a sound, it puts you back into that original event. So mine is a video recorder, constantly recording. When this traumatic event happens, the recording gets stopped and it goes on a reel. So just like Instagram has those reels where you could make a small snapshot, that is what happens with PTSD more or less, and you just relive that reel over and over. Triggers can vary from very simple things to very extravagant things. So typically, soldiers who go to war, one of their common triggers are loud sounds. Loud sounds could stem from anything, or sounds that could remind you of war and gunshots could go from things like a washing machine making its sound, a fan spinning could be making you remember the sounds of helicopters. Things like fireworks, the explosion sound that produce, it gives you that same type of reaction. So when you hear those things, you automatically go back into replaying that reel in your head or reliving that reel in your head. Some other triggers that soldiers do experience would be things that are associated with sight. So for example, you may see an unexpected motion or an unexpected person running, and that might create a reaction because when you are overseas and you are in a war area, people running is a constant thing. So you don't know if when you were there, you experience some degree of threat with seeing somebody running, and that part of running is part of that reel that plays back into head, it becomes a trigger. Things like IEDs that when you drive in and you get exposed to explosions and stuff like that, what happens again, the reel is there. So some of the things that you may look for is like, okay, I noticed a sign or some random marker on the side of the road that is associated with that specific trigger of that explosion. When you come back home and you drive in on the side of the road, you might see trash on the side of the road. You might see a strange person standing on the side of the road all by themselves on a phone, and that becomes a trigger for you because that's what you remembered from that original event of being in the war. Sometimes it might be smell of something burning because when there's that explosions, gunshot, there's that smell that is associated with it. Sometimes it might be smells of food. So for example, say if you were eating, eat a lunch or dinner on your base and then you took attack, sometimes just that smell of that food that you're eating within that specific time period becomes a trigger. So you're walking down the road and you smell that same thing, it triggers that reaction. So a lot of times, whatever senses it is, any of the five senses that could sort of correlate with that original event would always act as a trigger or may always act as a trigger in the future for you when you come back home. And that's what makes it difficult for individuals to adapt. Because yes, you come back home, but there's common sounds, everyday sounds that you might hear that would create sort of that same reaction for you in order to remember that aspect of your trauma or exposure to trauma at that point in time.
Okay, so yeah, so I think obviously we don't, in our brains we don't have an erase button that delete all. You know what I mean? Like we go in a computer, we want to clear the drive and say, okay, let's start from scratch. I mean, I wish there was a button, reset button here, but we don't. So that's the problem. To your saying that we, all of us, even normal people like who haven't served in the army, we are all exposed to some kind of a childhood memory, and then that gets triggered. If, to your point, simple things like senses, songs, music, sounds, suddenly you said, oh, boom, that's what it was. Now, let's talk about, I know you've written a book, Trauma to PTSD. What we want to talk about is specifically as a naturopathic doctor and as an acupuncturist, what are the tools? How can you help these people?
So a little bit about the book. The title is Trauma to PTSD. So what I did with my book is I wrote about different types of traumas, common type of traumas that we tend to overlook. And then how does that play into increasing the risk of one developing PTSD? So I'm going to go back to the example of soldiers going to war. You have 10 soldiers exposed to the same situation. 5 out of the 10 come back home and they develop PTSD, while 5 of them don't, and they were all exposed to the same thing. So one of the risk factors associated with PTSD is pre-existing exposure to different types of trauma and stressors, right? So within the book, I talked about, and even from a naturopathic perspective or even from an acupuncture perspective, taking the holistic approach, you want to understand what else could be potential risk factors, what else could be underlying root causes. So yes, you know that this individual went to war, that is one potential thing, but there may have been other subsequent or pre-existing things that may have increased their risk of developing PTSD. So there are things like neurochemical risk factors. So people who experience increased dopamine, increased epinephrine production, they tend to increase their risk of developing PTSD. If you have different types of neuroanatomic risk factors, so for example, if you have increased activity of the amygdala, which your amygdala is basically an alarm system that works for your body. If it's always hyperactive, then that increases the risk of you developing PTSD. There are genetic factors where there are SNPs of genes that they've found are associated with increased risk of things like PTSD. Nutritional deficiencies, so things like amino acids, vitamins, how does it nourish the brain? If the brain isn't functioning properly, then you increase the risk of developing PTSD. And then there's other risk factors, things like environmental toxicity, inflammation within the body, inflammation within the brain. It all creates an additional stress within the body. And PTSD says post-traumatic stress disorder. So whenever there's pre-stress that is already there, it increases sort of the risk. So I like using the analogy of thinking of ourselves as a boiling pot of water. All our past traumas are the lid or the cover on top of the pot. All our present traumas are the fire below us, and we are the boiling pot. So we are the container of that. And then our internal emotions and all of these things that water inside. So the heat from under the pot would increase the pressure with inside for the water. So as it starts converting from liquid into gas, there's that increased pressure because of the boiling. Now, if the weight on top of the pot, where there's that history of trauma, history of exposure to varying types of trauma, and all these other risk factors are putting more pressure on top of the pot, then they increase that amount of pressure within that pot. Then it becomes more explosive because there's no way that that lid was lifted off or to release that pressure. So it becomes sort of everything adds on onto each other, and it makes it sort of difficult, or it creates sort of like that perfect storm for individuals to develop PTSD. Um, Within the book itself, I covered things like transgenerational trauma, things like abuse, again, different types of risk factors that we're constantly exposed to, talking about things like social injustice, inequality, racism. How does these things affect us or increase the risk of us developing PTSD? So sometimes there are soldiers who go to war and they already have all of these pre-existing or pre-exposure to different types of traumatic events within their life. May have been that they grew up in an abusive home or they've been in an abusive relationship. So when they go to war, now you have an additional stressor that was there that sort of puts that extra pressure on top of the pot, allows it to be more difficult to deal with the stress of that specific event. And then moving on to, according to the title, trauma to PTSD. So you move from exposure to trauma to potentially developing PTSD. And then the second or subtitle to the book is called Root Causes to Healing Branches. So understanding all these different forms of root causes, transgenerational trauma. How does the effects of trauma passed on from generation to generation? How does that build up within our present generation? Being exposed to abusive relationship, growing up in an abusive home, experiencing things like nutritional deficiencies, not having that proper nutrition, not having that proper brain function to adapt quicker. All of those things comes up into that falling of potential root causes. Then beyond that, I talked about understanding our relation to trauma. So a lot of times we get into that cycle of trauma, we develop a comfort within trauma. And it's very common for individuals in the military. You go to war or you go overseas and you're exposed to this environment where you've been waking up to explosions. You're constantly having that gunfire back and forth, and that goes on, and it becomes a repetitive thing. So when you're there, you go into survival mode to survive all of these. You get so comfortable because it happens to you so often that when you come back home, you feel that what is normal is not normal to you, because you no longer have that constant adrenaline rush. You no longer have that constant exposure to bombs going off, weapons being fired, all of these extra stresses going on. So you develop comfort when you were there in that war zone. And when you come back home, you don't feel like you have that same degree of comfort. So in the book, I talked about that aspect of recognizing when you are stuck in that comfort for trauma, right? Then I talked about things like the onion layer of trauma. As trauma happens, we force ourselves to move on, right? We are designed to survive, so we would survive at whatever it causes us in the long run. So we're exposed to all these traumas and we put layers and layers of things to allow ourselves to move on. And instead of processing the trauma, we sort of bury it deeper and deeper inside. So when we start releasing trauma, when we start working on different aspects of trauma, you start noticing that, okay, today I'm exposed to one trauma, and then 10 days later I'm exposed to another trauma. When we start dealing with trauma and we start healing from it, we may peel off one layer and then another layer pops up. And that kind of creates that like onion layer effect, where every time you peel a layer off, there's another layer sitting right there below for you to deal with. And it's all just things that we've suppressed over the time that has built up there. And then I go into talking about varying types of healing modalities. So there are tons of research articles that shows you varying types of therapies, varying from pharmaceuticals to herbal medicine, homeopathy, art therapy, expressive therapy, animal therapy, agricultural therapy, all these variant types of therapy, talk therapy, that allows you to help process your trauma. So the more options that you know that are available to you, the more likely that you utilize them. A lot of people, when they come back home from war, you go to the VA, you get help. If you feel like you're there, if you feel like you're affected by PTSD and you seek out help, you may only be exposed to one type of therapy. And you may say like, okay, I don't feel comfortable talking about it. So if you go to the VA, you go to a doctor for help, and the only option that they offer is talk therapy, then if you don't feel comfortable talking about what was going on or what you've been exposed to, then you don't really get an opportunity to truly heal from it. You don't get a chance to truly process what went on. So in the book, I talk about how there's all these different modalities that you could utilize, from writing, from using music, art therapy, how you could use each one of these things as a modality to help you heal, whether it's done on a professional level, whether it's done on an individual level, sort of like a self-healing type therapy. And the biggest goal is really to process that trauma. If you don't process the trauma that you've been through, then it makes it difficult for you to actually be able to heal.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. This is a small session that I like to keep. I think we'd love to have you come back on talking about what the different therapies on healing part. But today, I think part one is really understanding for all the Army veterans that who spend years and years, whether it's in Vietnam, Afghanistan, or Iraq, when they come home, they're subjected to this PTSD, which they find it very difficult to overcome. And what we want to do is we want to at least bring out this topic and offer some kind of a help, to what they can do. So for today's session, I'd like to thank you. I think what we'll do is we'll do another session on the solution part of it. Yeah? Okay.
Sounds
All right.
good.
Thank you. All right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Ramdan, for being with us, for making all of us understand the different layers of trauma, the different layers of PTSD, and what happens to a brain, right? If someone has been exposed to a continuous pressure, or whether it is childhood abuse, whether it's in a war, or it is some kind of other emotional relationship that has not gone well, right?
And I just want to mention, for anyone that is interested in the book, again, the name of the book is Trauma to PTSD, Root Causes to Healing Branches. So in order to get access to the book, you go to www.traumatoptsd.com, and there is that link to buy either the print version, or there's a link in there if you want the ebook. So the ebook is sold on Amazon, the print book is sold outside of Amazon. So once you go to that one website, it would give you the link for either option, if you want the ebook or you want the print version of it. And I just want to also mention that when it comes to dealing with PTSD, first step is really to identify that you're being affected by it. And this is one of the reasons for today's session, where we talk about that root causes, understanding different aspects of PTSD. And once you're able to identify those things, seeking out the help is the next step. So first step is always identifying what is wrong. And I know it's very common within the military population that we feel that if we seek mental help, it's a sign of weakness, when actually it's not. When you seek that sign of help, when you get to that position where you feel comfortable enough to ask for help, it's actually more empowering, because when you realize that how trauma has affected you and how it's shifted your life, once you make that change and you realize that you're no longer just in survival mode, and you're able to actually thrive and blossom and become the best you that you could potentially be, then you truly understand the importance of it. So a lot of times we fall into that trap of feeling like being diagnosed with PTSD or being exposed to these traumatic events, if we seek help, it's a sign of weakness. No, it's not. It's actually weaker to prevent yourself from asking for help, because you just keep putting that extra pressure onto yourself, and you're making yourself just be in survival mode for a longer period of time. And then it creates more and more problem. One, for your personal health, and two, for everyone else around you. So the faster you seek help, it's usually better for an individual.
Sure, yeah, and yeah, that's the whole intention of this particular session, is to seek help, and the help is right there. You know, Dr. Ramdan has written a book, and he's helping. He can help you understand your problems, and also help you at least towards the path of moving forward. With that, I'd like to thank everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. Ramdan, for being with us, and we'll do a
No
follow-up
problem.
session on the solution part. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.